Professor, I'd like to begin with what we just heard with this sheriff, local sheriff in Michigan. What was your reaction to that?
You know, this, as many parts of this story, harkens back to a much longer history of white power movement and militia activism that gives us a roadmap for understanding this onslaught of what seems like just a crazy amount of news in the present moment. Here we have a local sheriff who is defending the right of a militia to enforce the law in some capacity. Now, all 50 states have laws on the books against exactly this. Militias are not allowed to do the work of policing. They are not allowed to do the work of law enforcement or soldiering in any of our states. And some states have additional restrictions against things like parading in public with firearms, intimidating with weapons, or conspiracy to deprive others of civil rights through intimidation, say at the polling place. But we also have a long history of people at the level of local sheriff and these kinds of movements supporting this kind of action. In fact, there's a long string of action around a group called Posse Comitatus, which believes in no legitimate law enforcement higher than the level of local sheriff. So there's a way that this all fits within this longer history and this longer playbook of white power and militia activism.
As you were speaking, Professor, on the screen, we saw photographs of this sheriff at rallies with some of these defendants. And it's up there on the screen again, showing you just how powerful the overlap is. He's friends with some of these people. The distinction between the accused and this sheriff is not so clear tonight.
I think the distinction is that the sheriff is a law enforcement officer and the militias are not. Now, whether that sheriff is exercising his duty is a different question, and we have safeguards around that. But there's no safeguard around militia activity in this way beyond the actual prosecution under the law. But we've seen several incidents nationwide of militia members being treated as sort of neutral arbiters of the law or neutral guarantors of law and order in various situations where they have led to harm. One might think of the reports of militiamen holding protesters for arrest in Portland. One might think of the militiamen who were so heavily armed around the Unite the Right rallies in Charlottesville that Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe said he couldn't send in police to protect counter demonstrators because they were outgunned. I mean, these groups are never neutral. They are always part of intimidation and violent threat. And some of them, as we see this week, stray further along that path towards domestic extremism and domestic terror. Now, the plot to kidnap the Michigan governor is not new. These sorts of ideas about kidnapping judges, state troopers, federal agents, elected officials, and holding them for trial. And I should note that for trial, although it's not clear in this case, in the past, for trial was thought to mean for trial by hanging or via oak tree. So there's a very real chance that what they meant by that was not just trial, but execution. These kinds of things have appeared to us many times in the past. The militia of Montana sought this kind of strategy, and so did other white power groups like the Order earlier in the 1980s. We've been with this movement for decades, if not generations, and the question is, why is it still here? Why have we as a society not confronted this threat?
What is your reaction to Governor Whitmer saying that she believes that Donald Trump has been encouraging this threat?
I think that's right. I think even in the most generous interpretation of what the president has said in the last, weeks, months, and years, just take the example last week of the debate and the Proud Boys comment. It's possible, I suppose, in the most generous interpretation that he meant to tell that group to stand down, but he didn't say stand down. He said stand by. And a whole bunch of activists, not just the Proud Boys, but people in militias, people in white power groups and elsewhere, have been effectively called to arms by the president's comment. And it's not just me that says this, not just historians. His own Department of Homeland Security and FBI have outlined that domestic terror from white supremacist extremists and affiliated groups is now the largest source of terrorist violence in the American homeland, more than what he calls Antifa and the left, more than Islamic jihadism, more than any other threat. This is the biggest thing. They also say in a report that came out this week that 2019 was the most violent, the most fatal year for this kind of violence since the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. Now, that bombing was the largest mass casualty event on American soil between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. But most people still don't know that this is part of a movement. That bombing was not just a one-off event, but was part of a social movement with deep, broad roots in our society.